So, what are the other major categories then? So, we've been talking a lot about tuition and fees, for example, but what are the other major categories of revenue for tuition dependent schools? I'm thinking of auxiliary revenues here, right? Room, board, activities fees, athletics, summer programs, anything else they're using their campus for?
Yeah. Well, no question, back to our conversation about net tuition and fee revenue, critical. But actually, net tuition and revenue has been declining both at public and private institutions as a percentage of total revenue over a decade plus. That's not to say it doesn't play a critical role in the bottom line. On the public side, what do we see? State and local appropriations are actually growing. Lot that runs counter, I think, to the headline a lot of people carry around, along with federal appropriations on the public side. On the private side, while tuition's still the largest source of revenue, auxiliary revenue is really the next most critical part of making the bottom line work. Auxiliaries as in dining, residence halls, bookstores, etc.
So, are you saying then that some schools might be quote unquote making money on auxiliaries while kind of losing money on, and I know those are not the proper financial terms, while losing money on tuition?
Well, I would hope there's not an institution in America that's losing money on the tuition side. Even though discounts are going up, we are still making some amount on each of those dollars that are spent. Part of that is also a function of, is that discount funded or not? It's one thing to just not collect it. It's another if I have the Rick Staisloff Endowment Fund for future CFOs, and I'm funding that scholarship. On the auxiliary side, though, it is often what makes the difference between being in a deficit or being able to break even for an institution. It is that important, particularly for private institutions.
Okay. So, where is there room for growth, or is there growth right now happening in auxiliary revenue? Is that where institutions are kind of pressing the pedal to the metal?
Yeah, the tricky issue on the auxiliary side right now with dining room and board, which is where most of it is overcapacity. In the current enrollment environment, as there's fewer students and fewer of those students are residential students, it's just a lot of beds that aren't filled. It's also a function of older housing stock, which just doesn't fit students' expectations. And it's often not cheap to live on campus, and yet you're not getting what would be considered sort of a market level of amenity in those facilities. And institutions may not at this point have the capacity to make the investment to bring them up to more of a market level.
So we've been talking a lot about tuition dependent, auxiliary revenue. Research is another area of big funding for some schools. A lot of this conversation over the last winter and spring, as you know, have been around indirect costs. But talk to us about how these research grants work and the revenue they bring in to cover administrative overhead. How does that all work as a system?
Yeah, it's definitely been in the news of late. So, you know, at its most fundamental, institutions get funding for research to cover their direct costs, right? Think of the salary for a faculty member that's doing the research. The institution might have, that was paying their salary is not going to move that over to the grant. So it's a direct cost that's getting supported. But institutions can also get funds on top of that for indirect costs, what, in other parts of the world we might just call overhead, right? For federal grants, there's a standard 15% indirect rate. If you want more than that, you have to negotiate for that. And many institutions, and of course, the kind of elite institutions that we read about in the headlines, have done that negotiation and have 50, 60% indirect rate. So much higher than the standard rate. So in essence, what the federal government has said is we're going to bring everybody down, what they want to do, to that standard 15% rate. And that's taking money off the table for institutions that were enjoying those larger amounts of funding from the higher indirect rates. Why is that a problem? Well, those institutions getting more indirect funding have built that into their expense structures, right? Those things have been around, allowed to support facilities and electricity and insurance and lots of things that allow the research to happen, but that also supports other things outside of research. So having built it into your baseline expense they're now faced with a situation of very suddenly having to pull that expense out of the equation.
So the other another category I should say is annual gifts. There are also endowments as well, and while at some schools, let's focus on endowments in particular. They provide, just a tiny percentage of current revenue each year. At others, and those are often the elite institutions, they can provide up to a third of operating revenue. Talk to us about how endowments, in fact, work and contribute to yearly operational revenue. How are they used as a lever? And what are the typical rules of thumb around spending down from them that are in use today?
Sure. I'm sort of unabashedly a big believer in earned revenue. That is, when you look at your operations, the programs and services you offer, what's the revenue you earn from that, and how does that relate to your expense? That said, as you just outlined, annual giving endowments can be important contributors to financial health. Standard spending from an endowment is 5% of a 3-year rolling average. So you kind of smooth out the ups and downs from your earnings and you let yourself spend 5% of that. That's to allow sort of the core funds, often called the corpus, to continue to grow. So you're just spending ideally from the earnings. I think in an ideal world, Michael, those funds from the endowment would support new investments in programs and services. They wouldn't be needed to keep the lights on. That's kind of why I led with my earned revenue point. Because if you're going to pay the electric bill, it's part of running your institution. So endowed funds, if you could use them for investment in new program growth, professional development, kind of helping the institution to keep bringing its mission forward in new ways. Now, that said, at many institutions, especially on the private side, they are a critical part of making the bottom line work.
So let's just hone in on that for a moment, because a lot of institutions, particularly the elite end, are using the endowment really to fund core operating priorities. So are they over relying on their endowment, or is it part of a diversified funding model? Is this a mistake that they have been making in your view, or is this just prudent diversification?
So, it's probably a good example that we won't spend a lot of time with of why the over focusing on elite institutions kind of distorts our understanding of higher ed finance. What MIT is or isn't doing with its multi-billion-dollar endowment, it's not really relevant, quite frankly, for most of higher education. So, for a typical institution, that's being prudent, that 5% spending rule is a good one. It allows you to contribute to the financial needs of the institution while making sure funds will be available over time. There can be some instances where it's appropriate to go above that 5%, as long as it's done transparently, with appropriate governance support, as long as, in my opinion, you're dealing with some kind of short-term budget situation or you're trying to smooth out the impact from what's going to be a longer-term budgetary change. I think the problem occurs when institutions use the additional endowment spending to avoid making necessary changes. This is where we get into trouble, and it's a really expensive way to kick the can down the road.
So, Rick, just so I understand that, there's a number of institutions now that are kind of on the financial bubble that are spending, they have been spending more of their endowment than that 5% number. And a lot of them claim they're using it as a bridge to get to the other side, but maybe not, right? Like, so that's the question here. It's okay to do it as long as you really are crossing a bridge and you are going to get, making those tough decisions to get to financial sustainability. But you may not know whether you're really going to get to the other side of the bridge, and you might just be spending that money to kind of just continue to kick the can down the road, right? That's the difference here, right? In terms of who's spending more than 5%.
Absolutely. I think you captured it well. And, so if the three of us were sitting on boards, and many of us do, I think this is the thing you have to think about. If management brings you a proposal and says, hey, we've got this budget gap and we're going to pull an extra X million from the endowment to close the gap, the next thing you need to be asking is, help me understand how we're not going to have that gap. What are we going to do? How long is it going to take? And if you have confidence that, over the course of a year, maybe 2 years max, in my opinion, you could really get there. Okay, I think that's an appropriate play. If, you keep coming back to the table and we're plugging these holes and we're not making the more courageous decisions about how to reset in terms of the foundation of budget and expense, I think we're kidding ourselves about what that extra endowment spending is doing for us.